This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Asop. Heavy drinking fuels violence. It drains public resources and shortens life expectancy. When teenagers binge drink, and around 30% of boys and 20% of girls in South Africa do, they are exposing themselves to a lifetime of health problems and social challenges. So if teen drinking is so bad, why do we allow advertisers to reach them? And if we were to restrict advertising, how would this impact the social fabric of communities dealing with the repercussions of heavy and binge drinking among adults and teens alike? These two questions are at the core of today's conversation with our guests, Kashifa Ancer, Campaign Manager for Rethink Your Drink, and Aadielah Maker, a Strategic Advisor at the Southern African Alcohol Policy Alliance, also known as SAAPA SA. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Kashifa, let's start with you. Can you contextualize for us what binge drinking is?
So when we're looking at binge drinking, we're looking at drinking more than 5 drinks per sitting in one period. So if you're looking at binge drinking, you're looking at people who engage in excessive amounts of drinking, but maybe they only do so at month end when they have the funds to be able to do so. Whereas when we're looking at heavy drinking, we're looking at the same kind of drinking, but consistently engaging in that kind of heavy drinking or in that kind of excessive consumption. So that is the difference between heavy and binge drinking, and South Africa in particular has a challenge with heavy and binge drinkers as opposed to what we refer to as low to moderate consumers.
So binge drinking is episodic and heavy drinking is if you are drinking a lot, maybe 15 drinks in 1 week, I'm told, is what amounts to heavy drinking.
Yes.
Staying with you, Kashifa, what do we know about the levels then of teenage binge drinking in South Africa and its impact on communities?
So what we know about teenage drinking, in particular in South Africa at the moment, is that it is very high. So there are unfortunately not any current studies to tell us what teenagers today are doing in terms of alcohol consumption. But a recent survey showed that young adults report having had their first drink before the age of 13. And that young people continue to drink heavily between the ages of 13 and 15. As you mentioned in your introduction as well, there is a larger challenge in South Africa with boys drinking more than young girls are drinking, and that can be associated with a number of things, including needing to appear more masculine, needing to appear more confident in social settings as well. So while we don't have data to depict the real challenge of what the situation is, we know that history does depict things like the Enyobeni tragedy, for instance, where 20 young people lost their lives, and we know that a tavern was filled largely with underage drinkers. Underage here, we're referring to under 18, which are essentially children. And so, yes, we know that it's a big, big challenge in South Africa, and we don't know the exact numbers, but we know that it's something that needs urgent addressing. Heavy drinking at such a young age is not good for the young brain, for the young growing body. I mean, the World Health Organization has gone so far as to say that no amount of alcohol is safe for anyone at any age. So if you compound that with the fact that your brain is still needing to grow, you're having challenges with school, you're going to have challenges with emotional regulation, having challenges with things like your kidneys, physical growth, your skin health, if we can even go to aesthetics as well. There are a number of challenges that young people will face if they do partake in excessive amounts of drinking at an early age.
Interesting, yes, and I'm told that the adolescent brain is still developing by age 25.
You're only really an adult. According to your brain, you're only really an adult by 25 years old. So drinking and affecting your frontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that decides logic and reason and all of those things, if you affect that part of your brain from an early age, the potential for you partaking in reckless behavior, even without alcohol, is much, much higher as an adult.
You've written an opinion piece recently where you said that alcohol marketing was particularly targeting young black people, a tactic with roots resembling how alcohol was used to dampen political opposition during apartheid. Tell me what you mean by this.
Yeah, so, contextualizing first, when we refer to black young people, we're speaking here non-white. And, when we're looking at our history, we're looking at things like the dop system during apartheid, and even colonial history and slavery history as well, where alcohol was used to control the young black mind in particular, because they would have been the most energized to oppose any kind of restriction upon them. So alcohol advertising or alcohol marketing today does not deliberately say we are going to dampen the young black mind, but they're also not trying to ensure that they empower the young black mind either. If we look at advertising and how it occurs in communities, black townships have really aggressive alcohol advertising. We're encouraging young black people to use alcohol to celebrate things. We know that in African culture, things like umkiti, all of these kinds of things have now been defined by how much alcohol is present at these kinds of events. And these events are there celebrating young people as young as 16 years old who've come back from the mountain and who are now growing into young adults. So industry, through their advertising, is directly encouraging young black people to celebrate their success and their growth and their improvement with alcohol. That is the industry's work, making sure they are part and parcel of every aspect of the young black life.
Aadielah, you want to add something to that?
In the northern countries, they have introduced more regulation. The consumers in the northern countries also understand the health consequence of alcohol more. So the industry is actively looking for another market. And one of the challenges we have as a continent is that it's estimated that we will have about 60% of young people under the age of 25 by 2050. So conquering the African market is very important for the industry if they're looking at their long-term profit market. The mere fact that we have a captive audience, according to them, on the continent is why they are also putting in so much effort. In addition to that, we also have very few young women drinking. And early on we spoke about it. So there's also a very aggressive outreach to try and get young black women specifically. And so I think it's the whole context that we need to look at why we are seeing this aggressive marketing towards young people.
That's interesting. I just want to follow up on what you said a little earlier about countries in the global north having introduced stricter regulations, because I can think of examples of countries that are known as big drinkers. So if you think about the pub culture in the UK, for instance, or Irish being big drinkers, the Australians being big drinkers, which countries in particular can you identify as having introduced the type of regulations that are stemming alcohol use?
So countries like Canada, countries like Wales have all introduced some of the World Health Organization's best buys or safer alcohol strategies to reduce harm. Lithuania, and specifically in terms of advertising, restricted advertising completely. There's no alcohol advertising in Lithuania. France doesn't allow alcohol advertising on TV and in cinema. If we're looking at the African continent, Kenya has now banned all alcohol ad to occur near schools, especially billboard advertising, because they had drinking occur from as young as 7 years old. And they realized that is because of increased alcohol advertising exposure to young children. And so that's the kind of restrictions that we're seeing, and those are the kind of restrictions that we're seeing working, because the research clearly shows that the more you expose young minds to this idea of beauty, this idea of self-expression, joy, confidence, all things that a teenager is desperate for as they're growing up. If you expose them to that at an early age and say, this 250 ml of something is going to make you feel this way, they're going to want it.
So what I'm hearing from you, Kashifa, is that binge drinking or heavy drinking is not simply the outcome of personal choices. It's not the outcome of bad parenting, but it's a product of a calculated marketing system. And we're seeing this play out in different ways, aren't we?
We're seeing it play out absolutely in so many different ways. Industry has so much influence within our culture to be able to turn the tide on heavy and binge drinking, and they're actively choosing not to do so because heavy and binge drinking is good for profit. If we look simply at health warning labels, for instance, if health warning labels clearly stated the danger that alcohol poses to the body, how much more would we be able to reduce heavy and binge drinking? Canada was able to show that by labeling alcohol bottles clearly to say that it caused 7 different types of cancer, they were able to see a reduction in consumption.
This idea of drinking responsibly puts the responsibility on the individual, and it's not clearly articulated what responsibly is. Is that a strategic decision by the liquor industry, do you think?
It points the finger to the individual. It doesn't talk about this very social construct that Kashifa was talking about, that we must acknowledge that the industry's job is to make profit for their shareholders. Their job is not to teach us about the facts of alcohol. And that's why the government's responsibility in regulating and ensuring that there's a policy in place that stipulates what the alcohol industry has to do. For example, provide information like they did in Canada. They are not going to do this by themselves. And that's why the issue around the Liquor Amendment Bill is so important, or any other piece of legislation and policy, is that it provides a policy framework within which it regulates industry, whether it's people that make bread, people that produce cars, people that produce alcohol needs to be regulated. And on top of that, we need to acknowledge that the harm of alcohol is like no other product. It's not an ordinary commodity, and therefore it requires regulation that begins to address those harms. And so we can't leave it up to the industry to decide what they're going to share with us as consumers. We need to introduce better legislation.
Let's take the conversation in that direction then. You mentioned the draft Liquor Amendment Bill, which I believe was introduced in 2016. There's another piece of legislation that was introduced a few years ago also. Neither legislation has been passed by the government. Why are we seeing this type of stalling?
Prior to the Liquor Amendment Bill of 2016, Cabinet actually discussed another piece of legislation that was specifically looking at the issues of alcohol advertising and marketing. It's called the Control of Marketing of Alcoholic Beverages Bill of 2013, which was discussed in Cabinet in September, and they were instructed to release it to the public for consultation. We have never seen that in the public sphere at all. And so the question is, what happened, right? And I think here we need to not, similar to the Liquor Amendment Bill of 2016, is that the alcohol industry is extremely powerful, that there is behind the scenes lobbying of our politicians, and we need to call it out for what it is, that there are lobbying happening by the alcohol industry that is preventing legislation from being passed in South Africa. Because we were concerned that the 2016 bill was not being passed, we decided to try and look behind, scratch the surface, trying to find out what happened. So we undertook a study, and we essentially went to NEDLAC. Now, NEDLAC is a statutory body that basically brings together government, labor, business, and community. What we did is we used the Freedom of Information Act to access the minutes of NEDLAC from 2016, from the introduction of the bill to as recent as 2022. And we found by going through the minutes of the NEDLAC system, where government, labor, industry specifically was discussing it at the exclusion of community, we found that there was very little community involvement in this discussion. Now the problem, and this is what the World Health Organization consistently said that the industry should not have a place at the policy table. That business should be, by the nature of governance, should be consulted around how they conduct their business. But once it comes to policy decisions, you can't have them at the table, because you can't be the player, the referee, the goalie. I mean, you're deciding the game rules if you're sitting at the table. What we've uncovered is that industry was overrepresented in these conversations around the Liquor Amendment Bill. On top of it is that you had organizations like aware.org, who currently is the vehicle that pushes the drink responsible tag, right? But they are funded by the alcohol industry. They are not independent. They are not people that can engage around looking at alcohol harm and getting South Africans to begin to rethink their drink in the way that we would want, right? Their board members are appointed by the industry. And they were one of the players in these policy conversations. What we need in South Africa is to move away from self-regulation, that the Liquor Amendment Bill specifically aimed to introduce provisions that would say that we should move in the direction of WHO recommendation that alcohol should be banned to the point of sale, that there should be nothing in the public space that advertises alcohol, and that it's only inside the shop where they sell alcohol that they should be allowed. Because I think we need to be very clear what point of sale means, is that the very physical building that alcohol is being sold in or consumed in cannot have any branding on the outside. So when you're looking currently in townships, and we're talking about where people live and where people are experiencing this problem, is that you've got murals that advertisers calling Black Label. You've got it on the tavern on the outside. If you look at how Heineken has reused the space to launch these lounges that is Heineken branded, all of that has to go. Because what Kashifa was saying is that our children walk every day past those alcohol outlets, right? And what it does, it normalizes alcohol in their lives.
So just to summarize the conversation thus far, the majority of South Africans don't drink, but those that do drink heavily and binge drink. We know that we have a problem with young people drinking, binge drinking in particular. We know that marketing is aggressive and advertising is aggressive. We also know that young people's brains are still developing up until the age of 25, so they will experience long-term health issues and will be adversely affected by alcohol when they drink at a young age. That all said, what evidence is there to suggest that restricting alcohol advertising to the point of sale only is going to reduce binge and heavy drinking?
We've seen that around tobacco. Advertising was banned. It has influenced how people consume using tobacco. And that's at the principle of introducing restrictions on alcohol marketing and advertising. The evidence is there. It says when a child is exposed to advertising before the age of 13, they are more likely to start binge drinking, right? And when they do drink, they binge drink in any one setting. That is joyous, celebratory, and you have these fridge doors opening and all you see is beers and beers and beers. It creates a mindset that is, and it's associated with fun, that our responsibility is to change that environment and alcohol marketing, placing restrictions on alcohol marketing, taking that out of the public arena, taking that off our televisions, away from billboards, away from schools, will begin to introduce an environment that does not normalize alcohol as just a product in our lives.
How can NGOs or civil society organizations or even individuals get involved in lobbying for stricter alcohol regulations?
Our main philosophy is always that increased education means decreased harm. And so NGOs, individuals, as Aadielah mentioned, have the responsibility to educate themselves first and then pass that education on to others in order to reduce the harm. In the non-profit sector specifically, NGOs, community organizations, community-based projects, and I'm talking about projects and structures that aren't even registered, who are doing work in the community to relieve harm, whether it be alcohol-related or not, can play a role in lobbying through participating in public comment processes. Yes, there is a challenge, firstly, in getting people to do that because people don't even know that such processes exist. How many South Africans, before doing this work, I did not know that liquor licenses need to be publicly gazetted before a liquor establishment is opened. So that's the kind of knowledge that we need to be passing on to non-profit organizations, community-based projects and structures in order to allow them to mobilize communities to be able to start reducing harm. And that's where I think we start. People don't need to have any kind of formal advocacy or policy advocacy framework in order to lobby against stricter regulation, or lobby for rather stricter alcohol regulation or alcohol advertising regulation. I think people need to realize that the power is in their hands, right? Our constitution has given us the power to control and manage alcohol and the state of alcohol in our communities, and we need to start using that. So that's where you start.
We know that NGOs experience firsthand the impact of teen binge drinking in communities. What are some of the social problems caused by alcohol consumption?
So specifically when it relates to teenage heavy and binge drinking and the consequences there, I think one of the biggest challenges that we don't want to speak about is sexual behavior. Risky sexual behavior, increased risk of STI exposure, HIV exposure. Teenage pregnancy becomes a much greater risk among young teenagers because of heavy and binge drinking as well. Violence is a big challenge. Looser inhibitions lead to those kind of violent behaviors. Sexual violence and gender-based violence becomes higher among young teenagers as well. We look at challenges like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder being an increased challenge, especially in provinces like the Western Cape and the Northern Cape as well, is something that can be prevented if we address underage drinking, because there is no awareness that there's a potential that I could be expecting, so therefore going to continue drinking as well. So those are some of the challenges that we're experiencing. Schools are experiencing big challenges in terms of academic performance, in terms of safety at schools as well. I've had many community members come and tell me that teachers are scared. Kids are coming to school drunk, in uniform, so buying in uniform. And these are some of the social impacts that we're experiencing at the community level with teenage drinking.
We know that civil society organizations are dealing with the social problems that you've outlined, Kashifa, and almost responding to the consequences of alcohol consumption rather than addressing alcohol consumption directly. Is that what we're seeing, Aadielah?
We also need to look at alcohol as a developmental obstacle. We need to get everybody to understand that the way alcohol is being marketed, being made available in our communities, the pricing of alcohol is allowing an environment to mask some of our developmental problems. That the issue around GBV or child abuse there's an intersection with alcohol consumption. And so part of our role as NGOs or civil society is to engage with everybody that's involved in development work on the issue of alcohol and what it means for their work that they are doing. That if we're going to limit ourselves to talking to people in the health sector, it's a very narrow focus. The very narrative that the industry is trying to spin of them as a contributor to our economy is actually false. That they contribute, but we as a country spend more money on dealing with the consequences and the harm of alcohol availability and consumption than what we gain from it. So in real terms, we know that between 4 and 6% of our GDP is from alcohol taxation, right? Revenue. But we spend between 10 and 12% of our GDP, you and me as taxpayers, our government spend money on dealing with alcohol harm. So we need to get people to understand that as individuals in South Africa, we are actually subsidizing the profit of the alcohol industry. And therefore, we should begin to own our right to participate in regulating alcohol as a very product that's available in our communities.
As we wrap up today's conversation, I want to know, what can NGOs do in communities to counter the negative impact of alcohol advertising on young minds? Kashifa?
One of the big themes coming out of communities all the way from here in the Western Cape down to the Eastern Cape that we've spoken to and sat down with community members and activists with is the lack of recreational facilities. Whether you are a soup kitchen, whether you do something to relieve unemployment, educating young people, find ways to make recreational activities available to young people. They have got nothing. And when I say nothing, they have got absolutely nothing to do after school, nothing to do over school holidays. And community organizations can really fill that gap to ensure that young people are kept active, that their brains are kept working, that they're kept entertained, because that's what they need to learn, is how to be entertained without alcohol. Those kinds of things are things that community organizations can fill. So I think that will be my biggest thing for today, is what can community organizations do? What can NGOs do? Open up recreational activities. And they don't need to be fancy. They really don't need to be, but we need to have them. They're a very big need in our communities.
I'd like to add and say that community-based organizations should object to any advertising, whether it's at the local spa, local OK, their little inserts that they produce and distribute, any billboards that's going up around schools, any spaces where young people are exposed to, that we as community-based organizations, NGOs, civil society, have the responsibility to begin to set an example for the very community members that we serve, that they can object. So part of our responsibility is to get people to understand their rights, is to get people to understand you don't require fancy words. You just have to say that I object to the fact that there's a billboard within less than 500 meters from where my child attends school. And that needs to be removed.
Just with what Aadielah said with regards to not having fancy words. You don't even need fancy equipment. Write it on a piece of paper. You know, we need to move away from this idea that commenting on these kinds of policies and these kinds of things require some kind of academic status to come with it. Aadielah did, and SAAPA worked on a beautiful initiative when the National Treasury released their taxation review for comment, is actually going into communities and helping communities handwrite their responses to National Treasury. So that's the thing that we want to encourage, is that you don't need anything fancy, grassroots. Send a voice note in. You know, there are many different ways that you can. It doesn't need to be in English. Let's go there. You don't need to comment on these things in English. You don't need to complain about these things in English as well. So find ways that work for you and work for your community to be able to make change, and use those ways.
We can also get communities to hold their ward councillors responsible, because the ward councillors have got the responsibility to engage them, to consult them, because that's the mandate, right? Our very system says that that's what their role is. And so we need to get communities to understand that the ward councillor actually has a responsibility to consult with them before they sign off on a liquor application. Very simple thing. The designated liquor officer in your community, at your local police station, have got some responsibility to make sure that he or she goes to every neighbor where that application is being submitted for, to say whether or not you know about it and if you agree. And we need to get young people to understand that they can be the drivers for that change. I don't want to I think that part of our challenges is that we talk about alcohol and young people, and then it could be perceived as a young people's problem, or we want to give the responsibility to young people for initiating the change. But they are the majority of the population, and therefore they've got power as a collective, and we need to harness that to bring about change.
Thank you, Kashifa and Aadielah. It's clear that binge drinking is hurting South Africa's young people in a country where tobacco advertising has already been restricted and there's ongoing debate about limiting the marketing of unhealthy foods to protect children. Why are we not applying the same logic to something as harmful as alcohol consumption? And now, over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have learned today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website, dgmt.co.za, and go to the podcast tab. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then maybe share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. What would it take for you, your organization, or your community to move from awareness to action when it comes to reducing alcohol harm? Question number 2. Who in your community benefits most from keeping alcohol advertising unregulated? And question number 3. Who is paying the highest price for unregulated alcohol advertising? This is DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.